Arben Dervishi, the mastermind who ruled Albania's shadows, and Elira Kodra, the woman who saw too much, were just the beginning. Behind their lives lies a world of betrayal, power, and secrets that stretches from hidden mountain labs to the streets of Europe, where every move can be deadly, and every shadow hides the truth. Albania is a land of contrasts, where rugged mountains rise sharply against the sky, and small villages cling to narrow valleys, as if hiding from the world. On the surface, life seems ordinary children playing in dusty streets, farmers tending olive groves, and markets bustling with local trade. But beneath this quiet exterior, secrets lie in every corner. Whispers pass from neighbor to neighbor, and old grudges simmer just beneath the surface. In this land, history is alive, and every stone seems to hold a story. Some stories, however, are meant to stay buried. For decades, Albania has been a crossroads of power, invasion, and survival. Its people are resilient, shaped by hardship and struggle, but the harshness of life has also given rise to cunning and secrecy. Families pass down knowledge of the mountains, hidden paths, and old codes that outsiders cannot understand. It is in these shadows that the seeds of organized crime took root, quietly spreading their influence while the world looked elsewhere. Small acts of defiance or rebellion against authority were often romanticized in villages, but they also became a training ground for a new generation of criminals. The cities tell a different story. Tirana, Durrës, and Shkodër hum with energy, but even here, the influence of crime is subtle yet powerful. Local businesses, once family-run and modest, sometimes operate under silent pressure from unseen figures. Corruption threads through politics and law enforcement, creating a gray world where right and wrong are difficult to distinguish. A businessman might smile in public while paying protection to a syndicate in private, and police officers may turn a blind eye, not out of weakness, but because survival in this system demands compromise. Even more striking is the way the criminal networks extend beyond Albania. These syndicates have eyes and ears everywhere, and their reach crosses borders. They are invisible in plain sight, blending into neighborhoods, offices, and social gatherings. Their presence is subtle yet terrifying. A missing shipment, a sudden disappearance, a warning left unspoken. Ordinary citizens may never encounter these figures directly, but their lives are quietly shaped by the decisions made in the shadows. The allure of power, combined with the constant pressure of survival, has created a culture in which loyalty and fear exist side by side. People speak in hushed tones, knowing that one wrong word can bring disaster. Families carry on with daily life, but the weight of the unseen world presses down on them. The mountains, forests, and narrow streets that define Albania's landscape are both beautiful and dangerous, offering protection for those who understand them and traps for those who do not. This is a country where the line between law and lawlessness is often invisible. The ordinary routines of life, school, work, celebrations exist alongside a hidden world of influence, manipulation, and control. Each village, each city street holds secrets, and every person carries a fragment of knowledge that could change everything if revealed. In Albania, the shadows are not just metaphors, they are living forces, shaping lives quietly, steadily, and without mercy. And for those who dare to step too close, the consequences are often sudden and irreversible. The early 1990s were a turning point for Albania. The collapse of the old political system left a vacuum that no one was prepared to fill. The streets were filled with uncertainty, and the ordinary rules of life seemed to have vanished overnight. For many, survival became the only law that mattered. In this chaos, small gangs began to emerge, exploiting the confusion and the gaps left by weakened authorities. What started as petty thefts and smuggling grew quickly into something far more dangerous. The law had lost its voice, and the syndicates found their power in the silence. These gangs were not uniform. Each had its own leader, its own code, and its own territory. Some inherited influence through family connections that stretched back generations, while others rose through cunning, deception, and sheer violence. Borders that had once been patrolled carefully became gateways for smuggling goods, weapons, and drugs. Coastal towns and mountain passes became secret highways for illicit trade, known only to those brave or foolish enough to navigate them. Each successful operation added wealth, confidence, and influence, creating a cycle that drew more people into the fold. It was a time when loyalty could be bought, fear could be weaponized, and power shifted overnight. Families who once lived in modest homes now controlled entire neighborhoods, while former soldiers and local enforcers became key players in the emerging criminal networks. Their methods were precise, often ruthless, and carefully calculated. Extortion, protection rackets, and smuggling were no longer small crimes. They became the foundation of empires built in the shadows. Ordinary citizens quickly learned that resistance could mean ruin or disappearance. Compliance became survival. The syndicates did not rise openly. They preferred invisibility. Meetings were held in abandoned warehouses, in mountain cabins, and behind closed doors in quiet cafes. Deals were negotiated with subtle signals, unspoken threats, and a shared understanding that betrayal could cost everything. Those who dared to challenge the rising power often vanished without a trace, leaving behind only rumors and fear. In this environment, trust was rare, and alliances were fragile, often lasting only as long as they served mutual interests. International observers were largely unaware of the scale of the problem. While Albania struggled to stabilize politically, criminal networks quietly expanded their reach into neighboring countries. Smuggled goods, weapons, and eventually drugs traveled across borders with astonishing efficiency. The world saw only glimpses of violence, an arrest here, a disappearance there, but the true scale of the syndicate's operations remained hidden. Their growth was methodical, patient, and almost invisible, leaving a landscape where ordinary life seemed unaffected on the surface, but where the foundations of society were quietly shifting. By the mid-1990s, the syndicates had transformed from local gangs into organized networks with influence over cities, ports, and even aspects of government. They had learned to adapt, to exploit chaos, and to survive scrutiny. Power was no longer measured by the size of a gang or the number of weapons they held. It was measured by reach, control, and the ability to bend circumstances without being seen. What began as small acts of opportunism had evolved into an empire operating in the shadows, one that would shape Albania for decades to come. The syndicates that had taken root in Albania were not anonymous forces. Behind their operations were leaders with sharp minds, ruthless instincts, and unshakable ambition. These were men and women who understood the power of influence, fear, and secrecy. Some inherited their positions through family connections, continuing legacies that stretched back generations, while others clawed their way to power through betrayal, cunning, and calculated violence. Their lives were a delicate balance between authority and danger, each decision carrying consequences that could be fatal. Every syndicate had its own hierarchy, carefully structured to maintain control. Subordinates carried out orders without question, while leaders observed from the shadows, rarely exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. The streets, mountains, and ports became chessboards, with every movement carefully planned. The leader's influence was not always visible, but it was felt everywhere. A quiet nod at a market could signal permission, while a warning glance could indicate an imminent threat. Ordinary citizens rarely saw these figures, but their presence shaped daily life in ways most could not perceive. The methods of these leaders were precise and often brutal. Disloyalty was met with swift punishment, and betrayal was rarely forgiven. Kidnappings, assassinations, and mysterious disappearances ensured that fear remained a constant companion. Yet their power was not only enforced through violence, it was also maintained through manipulation and subtle control. They invested in businesses, influenced politicians, and even co-opted law enforcement. Bribes, threats, and favors created a network of dependencies that allowed the syndicates to operate with near impunity. Trust, when extended, was both a weapon and a risk. Some leaders were known for their intelligence rather than their brutality. They studied law enforcement tactics, international trade routes, and market systems, using knowledge as a tool to expand their influence. Others relied on charm, building alliances that could be leveraged in moments of crisis. But all shared a singular trait, an instinct for survival. In a world where rivals could strike without warning and betrayal was constant, caution was as crucial as courage. A single misstep could topple an empire overnight. Their reach extended beyond Albania's borders. Syndicate leaders forged connections with criminal networks in neighboring countries, creating alliances that were as strategic as they were dangerous. International drug trafficking, smuggling, and money laundering operations became more sophisticated, relying on the expertise and networks of these leaders. The power they wielded was quiet but immense, capable of influencing not only local communities but entire regions. Despite their fearsome reputations, these leaders often appeared ordinary. They walked among the public, attended social events, and ran legitimate businesses that concealed their true activities. This duality made them nearly untouchable. Even when law enforcement agencies tried to act, the syndicate's careful planning and deep connections made capturing leaders a daunting task. Their control was invisible yet complete, a shadow over every street, business, and home. In the end, the leaders of Albania's criminal syndicates were defined by their ability to blend intelligence with ruthlessness, secrecy with influence, and fear with respect. They shaped the world around them without revealing their faces, moving silently through society while the shadows of their power stretched far and wide. Those who encountered them rarely understood the full extent of their influence, and those who tried to challenge them often paid the ultimate price. The rise of the drug empire was perhaps the most defining chapter in Albania's criminal history. The country's rugged terrain, hidden valleys, and poorly monitored borders created the perfect environment for illicit trade. What began as small-scale smuggling operations quickly evolved into a sophisticated network capable of moving vast quantities of drugs across Europe. From remote mountain labs to bustling ports, every step was carefully orchestrated to avoid detection. The syndicates had learned that power depended not only on fear, but on control, efficiency, and secrecy. Hidden deep in the mountains, makeshift laboratories produced substances that were then packaged and sent through an elaborate system of couriers, trucks, and ships. Villages that had once been quiet and isolated became critical hubs in the supply chain. Ordinary citizens were often unaware of the dangerous activities taking place around them, but the influence of the syndicates was impossible to escape. Local authorities were frequently bribed or intimidated, allowing shipments to move unchallenged. Even when raids occurred, the syndicates had contingency plans in place, leaving authorities with little evidence and empty warehouses. The scale of the operations was staggering. What had once been small quantities intended for local sale turned into shipments worth millions, reaching markets across Europe. The syndicates adapted quickly to new risks, changing routes, methods, and contacts with meticulous precision. Each successful operation increased their wealth, confidence, and influence, reinforcing their dominance in a world where mistakes could be fatal. Ordinary citizens rarely saw the leaders directly, but the shadow of their power was felt in every corner through intimidation, enforced loyalty, and the constant threat of violence. The drug trade also introduced a level of sophistication that had never been seen before in Albania. Money laundering networks were established to clean profits, often through legitimate businesses, real estate, and international bank accounts. The syndicates began to blur the lines between legality and criminality, creating an almost untouchable financial empire. Law enforcement agencies, both domestic and international, struggled to track the flow of money, often uncovering only fragments of a much larger picture. The syndicates had mastered invisibility, operating in plain sight while hiding the true extent of their power. The human cost of this empire was immense. Communities were transformed as addiction spread and violence became a constant threat. Families were torn apart, and ordinary citizens often found themselves caught between compliance and resistance. Those who tried to resist were met with swift and merciless punishment, ensuring that fear remained a key instrument of control. Even those who cooperated with the law often discovered that betrayal could come from unexpected sources: neighbors, friends, or even family members who had been drawn into the syndicate's orbit. The drug empire also strengthened connections between Albanian syndicates and international criminal organizations. Collaborations with networks in Italy, Greece, and beyond allowed for faster distribution, greater profits, and more sophisticated operations. These alliances created a web that was difficult to unravel, making the syndicate's influence not just national but regional. What had begun in secret mountain labs had now become a sprawling, organized enterprise, quietly shaping markets, governments, and the lives of countless people. In this shadowy world, control was maintained through a combination of fear, loyalty, and meticulous planning. The syndicate's drug operations were more than just criminal activity. They were the backbone of an empire that had learned to survive, adapt, and expand in a world that seemed determined not to notice. Every shipment, every transaction, and every calculated move strengthened their grip on Albania and beyond, leaving the country caught between survival and the relentless shadows of power. Power inside Albania's criminal syndicates was never stable. No matter how strong a leader seemed, danger always lurked within their inner circle. Betrayal was not an occasional threat, it was a constant presence, woven into the very structure of the underworld. Rivalries formed silently. Old grudges resurfaced at the worst moments. Ambition pushed even the most loyal members to consider turning against their own. In a world built on secrecy, trust became a rare and fragile commodity. Within each syndicate, hidden tensions grew behind closed doors. Enforcers who once followed orders without hesitation began to question their leaders' decisions. Younger members, hungry for power, studied every weakness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Even family ties were not strong enough to guarantee loyalty. Blood could be spilled as easily as promises were broken. A single rumor could destroy alliances that had taken years to build. Every meeting carried an unspoken tension, and every silence seemed filled with invisible threats. The most dangerous betrayals came from within the leadership itself. Advisors who were once trusted with the deepest secrets sometimes became double agents, feeding information to rival groups. Some sought to rise by eliminating their superiors, while others acted out of fear, believing that betrayal was the only way to avoid becoming a target themselves. Decisions made in desperation often sparked violent consequences. Entire operations collapsed overnight because one person acted on a hidden grudge or a whispered promise of greater reward. Assassinations became a method of communication in the underworld. Bodies left in remote fields or abandoned buildings served as warnings to anyone considering disloyalty. Disappearances occurred so quietly that families often never learned the truth. These acts were not random. They were calculated, designed to both punish and control. The message was always clear. Loyalty was expected, and disobedience would be dealt with swiftly. This environment of fear kept many in line, but it also fueled deeper resentment and paranoia. Some betrayals were more subtle, involving manipulation rather than violence. Financial sabotage, misinformation, and secret alliances created fractures that were invisible until they became impossible to repair. Leaders found themselves surrounded by people who smiled in their presence but plotted behind their backs. Deals were made and broken in the shadows, leaving everyone to wonder who was truly loyal and who was simply waiting for an opportunity to take power. Law enforcement occasionally took advantage of this internal chaos. Officers and undercover agents attempted to exploit divisions, offering leniency or protection to those willing to turn on their syndicates. But even cooperation with authorities carried risks. Those who accepted such deals often paid with their lives long before the law could provide any real protection. The fear of being exposed kept many silent, even when they wished to escape the cycle of violence. Despite the constant danger, the syndicates continued to operate, adapting to the shifting loyalties within their ranks. Leaders tightened their circles, relying on fewer people and imposing stricter rules. Yet the more control they tried to exert, the more instability grew beneath the surface. Betrayal became almost predictable, a natural part of a system built on power, greed, and survival. In the end, the criminal underworld of Albania survived not because it was united, but because every betrayal reshaped it in new and often more dangerous ways. The syndicates learned to navigate these fractures, turning chaos into opportunity. But for those living inside this world, the constant uncertainty created a life where every step was shadowed by suspicion, and every alliance carried the possibility of deadly consequences. Law enforcement in Albania faced a nearly impossible challenge. While the syndicates grew more powerful, the authorities struggled with limited resources, internal corruption, and constant threats. Investigators who dared to confront the criminal networks knew the risks. Every step toward uncovering the truth brought them closer to danger. Some continued out of duty, others out of desperation, but all understood that exposing the syndicates could mean sacrificing their own safety. The line between bravery and recklessness blurred as they worked against an enemy that seemed to have eyes everywhere. The task of gathering evidence was complicated by the syndicate's deep roots in society. Criminal operations were hidden behind legitimate businesses, political alliances, and community relationships. Officers trying to trace the flow of money often found that bank accounts were shielded by layers of false identities and international connections. Many attempted surveillance missions ended in failure, not because of incompetence, but because someone within the system had leaked information. Corruption acted as a silent barrier, erasing progress and protecting criminals who had infiltrated both local and national institutions. Journalists became unexpected allies in the fight for truth. Some dedicated their lives to investigating the syndicates, collecting stories from frightened witnesses and piecing together scattered clues. Their work often exposed aspects of the underworld that authorities could not reach. But journalists paid a high price. Threats against them were common, and a few disappeared altogether, leaving behind unfinished reports and grieving families. Those who continued did so with caution, knowing that their every move was watched closely. Their articles illuminated dark corners, but each publication increased the danger surrounding them. International agencies occasionally stepped in, hoping to dismantle the networks that extended across Europe. Collaborations with foreign governments brought advanced technology, specialized training, and fresh perspectives. Yet even these efforts were not enough to fully penetrate the syndicate's defenses. The criminals adapted quickly, altering routes, changing communication methods, and using coded messages that made interception nearly impossible. Every advancement by law enforcement was met with an equally strategic counteraction from the syndicates, creating an ongoing battle that rarely produced clear victories. Despite these challenges, moments of progress did occur. A small operation might be shut down, a minor leader captured, or a hidden stash uncovered. These successes gave the public hope, reminding them that the syndicates were not invincible. But each victory came with consequences. Retaliation was swift and brutal, aimed at both authorities and civilians. Explosions, targeted attacks, and intimidation campaigns created an atmosphere of constant fear. Families of investigators were harassed, and witnesses withdrew their statements, leaving cases unfinished. The price of justice was high, and many wondered whether the fight would ever end. Some law enforcement officers became symbols of resistance, known quietly among communities for their persistence and courage. They worked long hours, lived cautiously, and maintained strict secrecy about their investigations. Their determination kept pressure on the syndicates, preventing them from feeling completely untouchable. But the emotional and physical toll was immense. Stress, isolation, and constant danger pushed many to the brink, forcing some to step away for the sake of their families. Those who remained understood that their efforts were part of a much larger struggle, one that required endurance rather than quick victories. In the end, the conflict between law enforcement and the syndicates became a silent war fought in alleys, offices, and remote villages. It was a battle not only for control, but for the future of Albania's society. The authorities sought to bring light into the shadows, while the criminals worked tirelessly to protect their hidden world. The outcome remained uncertain, shaped by every investigation, every risk taken, and every truth uncovered. In this ongoing struggle, justice seemed close at times, yet always just out of reach. As Albania's criminal syndicates strengthened at home, their influence quietly stretched far beyond the country's borders. Europe, with its open markets, busy ports, and millions of unsuspecting citizens, became the next stage for expansion. What began with small smuggling routes soon evolved into a sprawling international operation, one that blended into the continent's complex transportation systems and diverse communities. The syndicates understood that to grow, they needed to adapt, innovate, and remain invisible. Their success depended on staying one step ahead at all times. Major European cities provided the perfect environment. Places like Milan, London, Brussels, and Berlin offered anonymity within dense populations. The syndicates embedded themselves into immigrant communities, blending with ordinary workers, business owners, and travelers. Their presence was rarely obvious. Instead of drawing attention, they relied on low profiles and quiet operations. Apartments became safe houses, restaurants became fronts, and warehouses turned into key storage points for drugs, weapons, and money. Their networks expanded like hidden routes, connecting countries through untraceable channels. The syndicates also recognized the value of alliances. They forged connections with criminal groups in Italy, Spain, Greece, and even as far as South America. These partnerships were based on shared profit rather than trust. Each organization offered something the others needed: routes, protection, resources, or specialized skills. Together, they created an international web of crime that was almost impossible to dismantle. Even when one branch was exposed, the rest of the network continued to function, adapting quickly and filling any gaps. Human trafficking became one of the most disturbing elements of their expansion. Vulnerable people from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa were promised better lives, only to be trapped in exploitation. The syndicates ran these operations with chilling efficiency, transporting victims across borders using forged documents and corrupt contacts. Many disappeared into underground industries, never to be heard from again. Even when authorities managed to rescue victims, identifying the masterminds behind the operations was nearly impossible. The syndicates ensured that the real decision-makers remained hidden behind layers of intermediaries. Money laundering grew even more sophisticated as profits increased. The criminals invested in luxury apartments, transport companies, nightclubs, and import-export businesses. Some even used cryptocurrency networks to obscure the origins of funds. Their financial systems became so complex that investigators often found themselves tracing transactions that led in circles, ending with shell companies in distant countries. The syndicates had effectively transformed illegal earnings into clean money, allowing them to expand further without drawing unnecessary attention. Europe's law enforcement agencies eventually recognized the scale of the threat. Joint operations, intelligence sharing, and international task forces were formed to combat the growing criminal influence. Yet even these measures struggled to keep up. The syndicates were agile, shifting their strategies every time authorities closed in. When one route was monitored, they opened another. When one method became risky, they developed a new one. Their adaptability made them one of the most resilient criminal forces on the continent. Communities across Europe felt the consequences. Neighborhoods changed quietly as new faces appeared. Businesses shifted ownership, and unexplained violence erupted without warning. Many people sensed that something darker was at play, but could not identify the source. The syndicates relied on this uncertainty. The less people understood, the easier it was to operate. By this stage, Albania's criminal networks were no longer confined to their homeland. They had become international shadows, shaping events, influencing markets, and exploiting weaknesses across the continent. Their journey from small local gangs to global criminal powers was nearly complete, and Europe had become the battleground where their future would be decided. The true extent of Albania's criminal syndicates remains hidden, a secret woven into the country's mountains, cities, and borders. While international authorities occasionally make headlines with arrests or seized shipments, the core of these networks continues to operate undisturbed. For every leader caught, another emerges, often stronger, more cautious, and more ruthless than before. The syndicates have learned to survive scrutiny, to adapt to changing conditions, and to exploit every opportunity. The shadow they cast is long, and it touches every corner of society, often without people even realizing it. The consequences of their power are felt most acutely by ordinary citizens. Families live under the quiet pressure of fear, knowing that a single wrong move could invite retaliation. Children grow up witnessing the subtle influence of these networks' neighbors disappearing, businesses suddenly closing, and unexplained wealth appearing in homes that had once been modest. Communities adjust to the presence of crime as though it were part of everyday life, learning to comply quietly, speak carefully, and hope that the syndicate's attention does not turn toward them. Survival is measured not by wealth or status, but by invisibility and discretion. Even those who operate outside the syndicate's control are affected. Politicians, law enforcement officers, and journalists often find themselves caught between public duty and personal safety. Investigations are slowed or abandoned because of threats, bribes, or intimidation. Stories remain untold, evidence remains hidden, and justice is delayed, sometimes indefinitely. The shadow of the syndicates stretches over the systems meant to protect citizens, making the line between law and lawlessness almost impossible to distinguish. The syndicates themselves have become masters of duality. On the surface, some leaders appear to be legitimate businesspeople, philanthropists, or community figures. Their presence is often normalized in public spaces, hiding the darker truth of their operations. Beneath this facade, however, they maintain meticulous control over a web of illegal activities, smuggling, human trafficking, drug operations, and financial manipulation. The world sees only fragments of their actions, while the majority of their influence remains invisible, silently shaping lives and markets. Even within the syndicates, power remains fragile. Betrayals, rivalries, and mistrust ensure that no leader is ever entirely safe. Violence is both a tool and a threat, maintaining discipline while reminding everyone that a single misstep can be fatal. The most experienced operatives know this well, and yet, despite their awareness, the pressure of constant vigilance weighs heavily on everyone involved. Fear, loyalty, and survival are intertwined in ways that outsiders cannot fully comprehend. The untold truth is that the syndicate's power is not just about crime. It is about influence. They shape politics, economies, and communities, often without leaving clear evidence. Their legacy is measured not only in illegal profits, but in the silent compliance of those living under their shadow. Albania's criminal networks have become an invisible force, one that continues to grow, adapt, and survive. In the end, the story of these syndicates is not a tale of dramatic confrontations or final victories. It is a story of shadows silent, pervasive, and enduring. The true scale of their operations may never be known. For every light cast on their actions, another darkness rises to take its place. The country, its people, and the world continued to live under the quiet influence of these unseen forces. The shadows linger, leaving questions, fear, and the faint hope that one day the truth might finally emerge, fully illuminated.